Number 10. The Hashashin. A Crusader knight wakes in his tent in the Holy Land and finds a dagger driven into the ground beside his sleeping head. No guard heard anything. No perimeter was breached. The message is not that they came. The message is that they can come again. That is why the Hashashin have to open this countdown. The Nizari Ismailis, who built their strongholds around Alamut and later in Syria, did not rule through open conquest. They ruled through infiltration, patience, and the psychological effect of proving that rank and bodyguards were not enough. Their most famous killings were not random murders. They were signals aimed at viziers, generals, princes, and rulers who suddenly had to live with a new possibility inside their heads. You could command armies and still not be safe inside your own tent. That is what made them feel larger than they were. The mainstream explanation is that the Hashashin succeeded because they chose targets with extraordinary care, built local intelligence patiently, and used public, high-value assassinations to compensate for limited manpower. That explanation is strong. It also clears away the lazy mythology. The famous Hashish story is widely treated by serious historians as hostile legend rather than proven operational reality. Their real weapon was organizational discipline. A small movement scattered across mountain fortresses learned how to make empires feel penetrable. Saladin could survive battles and still wake to find that someone had reached the intimate space around his body. Conrad of Montferrat could be a king one day and dead in the street the next. The deeper point is that the Hashashin did not merely kill powerful men. They changed the emotional geometry of power. After them, a ruler could not measure safety only by walls and soldiers. He also had to measure it by how many people around him might already belong to someone else. Number 9. The Thuggee. A traveler joins a small group on the road through India because the road is safer in company. That assumption is the first thing the Thuggee turned into a liability. They matter here because they reveal a different architecture of fear from the Hashashin. The Hashashin terrified rulers by proving they could reach the guarded and the powerful. The Thuggee terrified ordinary movement itself. Merchants, pilgrims, carriers, and strangers met on the road, shared food, shared stories, and kept walking together until the signal came. Then a cloth tightened from behind, the body dropped, the grave was prepared, and the group moved on. This is why the Thuggee remains such a disturbing case even after historians pushed back against the most inflated colonial numbers and the most theatrical British accounts. Strip away exaggeration and the core still holds. This was organized murder made routine. It was system, repetition, and trust converted into method. The mainstream explanation is that the British turned a real but varied criminal phenomenon into a more unified conspiracy than the evidence always supports, partly because doing so justified surveillance, policing, and imperial intervention. That caution matters. But it does not erase what made the phenomenon so frightening. The killings were structured. The technique was standardized. Victims disappeared into roads, fields, and burial sites with a level of calm efficiency that made the violence feel almost administrative. That is the deeper reason the Thuggee belong this high in the countdown. They show that an assassin cult does not need a fortress, a manifesto, or a king-sized target list to terrorize the world around it. Sometimes it only needs a repeatable method and the ability to make a basic social instinct feel dangerous. Traveling with company should increase the odds of survival. In the Thuggee world, it could do the opposite. And once a killer organization learns how to hide inside one of the most ordinary human acts, the next kind of terror becomes even more modern because now the crowd itself turns into the perfect place to kill. Number 8. The Sicarii. A festival crowd is the perfect hiding place until it becomes the perfect killing field. That is where the Sicarii enter this countdown. In 1st century Roman Judea, they turned density itself into a weapon. Their name came from the sica, a short curved dagger small enough to conceal beneath clothing, and deadly enough to finish a target before the crowd even understood what had happened. This matters because the Sicarii were not simply angry rebels lashing out wherever they could. They understood that symbolic killing in public can frighten a society far beyond the immediate body count. A victim collapsed, panic spread, and the killer was already disappearing into the movement of the crowd. That technique changed the meaning of public space. Once, a man could be murdered in broad daylight during a festival, and the attacker could melt away among worshippers. Empire no longer looked fully in control of its own streets. The mainstream explanation is that the Sicarii were an extremist offshoot of the larger anti-Roman resistance, using assassination as an asymmetric response to overwhelming military power. That explanation is strong. Rome could crush armies in the open. It could not as easily stop a blade hidden in civilian life. But the deeper point is what that tactic did psychologically. The Sicarii did not need to kill everyone they hated. They only needed to prove that collaborators, officials, and public figures were reachable in spaces that should have felt safe. Once that happened, fear began doing part of the work for them. Every crowd became ambiguous. Every jostle felt different. Every public appearance carried a new calculation. This is why the Sicarii belong so high in the countdown. They show that an assassin order becomes truly dangerous when it can turn the normal flow of daily life into cover, confusion, and pressure. And once killing moves from roads and tents into the center of the city itself, the next step is even more unsettling, because now the blade is no longer the whole doctrine. Information is. Number 7. The shinobi clans of Iga and Koka. The most feared covert orders do not always kill first. Sometimes they make your camp deaf, blind, divided, and uncertain, then decide whether killing is still necessary. That is where the shinobi traditions associated with Iga and Koka become so effective in a countdown like this. Popular culture flattened them into black-clad fantasy figures, but the historical core is more interesting and more dangerous. These were networks of infiltration, reconnaissance, sabotage, deception, coded communication, and selective violence that grew out of the fractured warfare of medieval Japan. The point was not theatrical stealth for its own sake. The point was to enter where others assumed entry was impossible, gather what others could not see, and alter conditions before open force arrived. In that sense, the shinobi clans belonged to the same dark family as the Hashashin and the Sicarii, even though their methods were broader. They did not merely remove a person, they destabilized systems. The mainstream explanation is that Iga and Koka produced specialized practitioners because the Sengoku world rewarded intelligence work, covert movement, and flexible, irregular methods. That explanation is convincing. Constant war creates demand for information, but the deeper reason these clans terrified larger powers is that they attacked confidence. A ruler can prepare for a siege. A commander can count visible troops. What he cannot easily count is rumor, infiltration, night entry, arson, poisoned water, missing documents, bribed servants, and shifting loyalties inside the camp. That is what makes the shinobi such an important second case in this part of the video. They push the idea of the assassin order beyond the knife. Once an organization learns how to weaponize uncertainty itself, Empire starts spending energy not only on defeating enemies, but on figuring out where the attack is really coming from. Number 6. The Vem. A man wakes to find that someone in the next district has been hanged from a tree before dawn and pinned to the body is a warning every noble in the region understands immediately. That is where the Vame enters this countdown. It did not operate like a mountain sect, a road cult, or a crowd assassin network. It operated through the language of law. In the fragmented world of the late medieval Holy Roman Empire, the Vame, or secret Vamic courts, developed a reputation for trying defendants in secrecy, issuing judgments in absentia, and leaving behind executions that looked less like murder than the physical afterimage of an invisible sentence. Most assassin orders create terror by proving they can reach a target. The Vame created terror by making people suspect they might already be condemned. You do not merely fear the knife, you fear the possibility that the verdict has already been delivered and is now traveling toward you through people you cannot identify. The mainstream explanation is that the Vame grew out of weak and fragmented governance, especially in Westphalia, where local enforcement was inconsistent and secret jurisdiction could be justified as a way of imposing order when ordinary structures failed. But the deeper issue is what the institution became in the imagination of those living under its shadow. A public court punishes openly. A secret court punishes psychologically before it ever kills. The moment a sentence can be issued, circulated, and executed through an unseen brotherhood, law begins to feel less like procedure and more like stalking. That is why the Vame works so well in the middle of this countdown. It shows a covert killing system disguised as legitimacy. The Hashashin used elite terror. The Thuggee used trust. The Sicarii used crowds. The shinobi used information. The Vem used judgment itself as a weapon. And once a state learns how powerful that weapon can be, secrecy stops hiding inside courts and starts hiding in the administrative bloodstream of empire itself. Number 5. The Frumentarii. An emperor can survive external enemies more easily than he can survive a network that reports to him by day and quietly becomes dangerous by night. That is what gives the Frumentarii their power in a video like this. They began in the Roman world as a practical institution linked to grain supply and military communication, which meant they already possessed the one privilege every covert organization needs before it becomes frightening: legitimate movement. Men who can travel widely, carry official authority, enter military and civilian space, and ask questions without immediately triggering suspicion are already halfway to becoming an intelligence service. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries A.D., that is exactly how the Frumentarii increasingly appeared. They were no longer just logistical personnel. They had become couriers, observers, informants, and instruments of imperial surveillance. That matters, because the road from intelligence collection to deniable violence is often shorter than empires want to admit. The mainstream explanation is that the Frumentarii evolved organically as emperors needed more information from farther away, and found it convenient to use an existing structure with mobility and administrative access. But the deeper reason they terrified people is that they blurred lines no ordinary subject could safely map. Were they messengers, inspectors, spies, blackmailers, arrest agents, or something even darker? In practice, that uncertainty became part of their power. The empire had created a class of men who could move through its own body unnoticed enough to know too much. And once that happens, assassination no longer needs to arrive as a stranger at the gate. It can arrive as paperwork, logistics, a sealed order, or a man whose authority looks routine until someone disappears. That is why the Frumentarii belong so high in the countdown. They represent the point where covert killing stops being only the work of cults and sects and becomes a structural temptation inside empire itself. Number 4. The imperial poison networks. Not every assassin order announces itself with a blade. Some work through dinner, medicine, incense, servants, and private rooms. That is what makes imperial poison networks so effective in a countdown like this. They do not always survive in history as one cleanly named brotherhood, but they appear again and again inside courts, where rulers are physically closest to danger and least able to control everyone around them. The mechanism is simple and terrifying. An emperor can inspect his bodyguards. He cannot inspect every hand that prepares a cup, every attendant who enters a chamber, every physician who measures a dose, or every courtier who quietly benefits if one body stops breathing and another takes the throne. Poison turns intimacy into vulnerability. It allows violence to travel through routines designed to look harmless until the target is already failing from within. The mainstream explanation is that court poisonings were products of factional politics rather than a single organized international order, and that is correct. But the deeper reason they belong here is that repeated palace poison networks reveal a stable form of covert killing that empires kept generating for themselves. Once succession becomes uncertain, proximity becomes political capital. The people closest to the ruler become channels for removal, persuasion, blackmail, and quiet execution. That changes the emotional structure of power in a way open rebellion cannot. A usurper outside the walls is visible. Poison inside the walls is intimate and deniable. It can be blamed on illness, weakness, divine judgment, or bad luck. This is why palace murder matters so much in the logic of the video. It proves that some of the most dangerous assassin systems in history did not hide in mountains or forests at all. They hid inside the ordinary maintenance of the state. And once covert killing reaches that level of access, the next figure in the countdown becomes even more dangerous, because now the operation stretches across fortresses, alliances, and a whole region trained to fear what one message beside a sleeping head might mean. Number 3. Rashid al-Din Sinan. If Hassani Sabah built the legend of the assassins, Rashid al-Din Sinan made that legend feel personally unavoidable. Known in later memory as the Old Man of the Mountain in Syria, Sinan turned a Nizari network in the Levant into something larger than a frontier sect. Under him, assassination became not only a tactic, but a calibrated language of pressure aimed at rulers who commanded far larger resources than he did. That is why he works so powerfully this late in the countdown. By now, the viewer understands how covert organizations kill. Sinan shows how they make killing unnecessary by proving they could do it whenever they chose. The stories around him matter because even when details are disputed, the pattern is consistent. High-value targets knew his reach was real. Conrad of Montferrat was killed. Saladin survived attempts and then had to live with the knowledge that someone close enough to his sleeping space had crossed every boundary that should have protected him. The mainstream explanation is that Sinan was an exceptionally gifted political operator working inside the fractured Crusader and Islamic frontier, using selective violence, diplomacy, and psychological leverage to keep a small mountain power relevant. That explanation is strong. But the deeper point is what his organization did to scale. It made rulers negotiate with fear itself. This was not random bloodshed. It was highly rationed violence aimed at generating maximum strategic effect from minimum manpower. Once a single successful penetration could alter the behavior of a man commanding armies, the arithmetic of empire began to look unstable. That is what makes Sinan such an effective prelude to the final part of the video. He stands at the point where the assassin order becomes more than a cult, a court instrument, or a hidden tribunal. It becomes a doctrine of pressure so refined that the possibility of death begins doing almost as much work as death itself. Number 2, the Leopard Society. The Leopard Society is where this countdown becomes harder to classify in ordinary political terms. A body is found in a village clearing, torn open in a pattern that resembles an animal attack, except the details do not sit right. The wounds look too controlled. The organs are missing in ways a wild predator would not arrange. No one admits to seeing anything. That is how the Leopard Society enters the story. Across parts of West and Central Africa, especially under colonial observation in the 19th and early 20th centuries, this secretive network became associated with ritual killing, political intimidation, and violence, disguised through the image of the leopard itself. That image mattered because it did more than hide human agency. It moved the murder out of ordinary legal language and into a zone of fear, where people no longer knew whether they were dealing with criminals, spirits, enforcers, or something in between. A killer is frightening. A killer who can make the village speak in symbols instead of names is much worse. The mainstream explanation is that the Leopard Society functioned as a secret power structure tied to social control, ritual authority, and violence in regions where formal state power was weak, distant, or distrusted. That explanation is strong. But the deeper point is what kind of terror this produced. The Leopard Society did not merely threaten a ruler in a fortress or a commander in a tent. It threatened the possibility of clear explanation itself. Once a killing can be made to resemble nature, witchcraft, or sacred punishment, the target is not just the body on the ground. The target is the community's confidence that violence can still be traced and answered. That is why this case belongs so high in the countdown. Other assassin orders weaponized secrecy. The Leopard Society weaponized ambiguity. They turned concealment into folklore and made fear move through rumor as efficiently as through blood. And once a small hidden organization learns how to do that, the final step in the video becomes brutally obvious. The most dangerous of all are the groups that do not merely terrorize empires from the edges. They ignite events so large that the whole modern world feels the shock. Number 1, the Black Hand. The Black Hand is the right final case because it proves that a relatively small clandestine organization can do more than frighten an empire. It can help push whole systems toward disaster. By the early 20th century, this Serbian secret society had fused nationalism, covert planning, military links, and political violence into a structure far more dangerous than its size suggested. That is the key pattern the entire countdown has been building toward. The Black Hand did not need to command huge armies directly. It needed access, discipline, deniability, and men willing to act at the exact pressure points where one death could trigger a chain reaction. That is what happened in Sarajevo in June 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, who was tied into a network of planning, training, and support connected to men operating in the shadow of the Serbian state. The murder itself took seconds. The consequences tore open the 20th century. The mainstream explanation is that the First World War was not caused by one secret society alone. Alliance systems, imperial competition, mobilization timetables, and accumulated tensions had already built a continent ready to ignite. That explanation is essential and correct. But the deeper issue is what the Black Hand demonstrates about covert power. A hidden organization does not need to control every variable to change history on an enormous scale. It only needs to understand where pressure is building and where one violent act can collapse the restraint around it. This is why the Black Hand is such a devastating endpoint for the countdown. The Hashashin taught rulers they were reachable. The Sicarii turned crowds into assassination cover. The Frumentarii made surveillance and state violence blur together. Rashid al-Din Sinan perfected targeted psychological pressure. The Leopard Society turned murder into communal dread. The Black Hand did something even more dangerous. It showed that a disciplined secret network could insert itself into a geopolitical fault line and let empires destroy themselves afterward. That is the real pattern connecting all 10 organizations. They did not share one religion, one geography, or one exact method. Some used daggers. Some used cloth. Some used poison. Some used information, courts, symbols, or ritualized fear. But all of them understood the same structural truth earlier than the powers around them did. A small organization can exert influence wildly out of proportion to its numbers. If it is secretive enough, disciplined enough, and patient enough to strike where systems feel safest. Armies break walls. Assassin orders break certainty. They force rulers, governors, nobles, and whole populations to recalculate daily life around the possibility that the next blow will come from inside the perimeter, inside the crowd, inside the court, inside the archive, or inside the alliance network itself. And that may be the most unsettling lesson in the whole video. Empires usually imagine collapse arriving in visible form, through invasion, rebellion, famine, or defeat on the battlefield. These organizations understood another route. You do not always need to overpower a giant system. Sometimes you only need to make it doubt itself, fear its own servants, mistrust its own roads, and panic at the idea that the people standing closest to power may already belong to something else. Once that happens, the empire begins doing part of the work of terror for you.